In this video, we're going to examine balance of payments. Let me start by discussing the financing of the trade deficit. Trade deficit may be financed in different ways. It's not all borrowing. Let's see what are those mechanisms. One of them is factor income. Factor income is the money that our factors of production, like labor and capital, earn in other countries and remit them to our country. For example, if American companies invest in other countries, make profits, and remit them to the United States, we can use that money in order to import more than we're exporting. So that covers part of our trade deficit. Another way to finance trade deficit without borrowing or reducing the country's assets is to have some luck and get gifts. If foreigners provide gifts or unilateral transfers to our country, then we can use that money to import more than we're exporting. If we, of course, give gifts to other countries, our country transfers money to other countries, then that has to be financed somehow in addition to the trade deficit that we have. There's a third way of financing the trade deficit without borrowing, and that's using the official reserves. All central banks, perhaps with the exception of the United States Central Bank, the Fed, hold some foreign reserves in order to make sure they have reserves, they have foreign currency if need arises for imports. So central banks can use part of their reserves to pay for imports in addition to exports that we have and help us finance the trade deficit. Note, however, there's a bit of a difference between factor incomes, unilateral transfers, and official reserve transactions. Factor incomes and unilateral transfers are current income, are flow variables. Reducing the country's reserves is a capital transaction, and that's why official reserve transactions are considered part of capital account and different from the current flows, which are called current account. When we take into account the role of factor incomes and unilateral transfers and official reserve transactions in financing the trade deficit, whatever is left has to be borrowed money, borrowed from the rest of the world. In essence, the residents of our home country have to issue promissory notes or IOUs, give it to foreigners, get their money in order to be able to import more than they're exporting. This is essentially borrowing, and it's called non-reserve asset transactions. Another capital account transaction, which affects the net worth of the country, because when we borrow or we run down our assets, we're reducing our net worth. So let me explain this in more specific terms. Our net exports plus the net inflow of factor incomes, or FI, and unilateral transfers, UT, add up to a variable, an amount that we call current account. So that terminology is very common. Current account balance represents the money that we either have to finance through reserves, reserve reductions, or borrowing. If we're running a trade deficit and net exports is negative, to the extent that factor income and unilateral transfers are on the net positive, that reduces our current account deficit and the amount that we need to borrow or reduce our reserves. But if factor income is negative, unilateral transfer is negative, that adds up to the trade deficit, and our current account deficit is going to be even bigger. Capital account, which we usually show by KA, is equal to the official reserve transactions and IOU transactions, or non-reserve transactions. So KA is equal to OR plus NR. Also notice that we always must have capital account and current account exactly equal to 0. If you're running a current account deficit by $1, that money has to be either borrowed or financed through reserve reductions. So in that case, our capital account has to be positive, meaning that we have to send a piece of paper, either the reserves that we have or some IOU that we issue, we have to export that to get the foreign money in order to finance our current account deficit. On the other hand, if you have a current account surplus, then that means that we need to lend to the rest of the world in order to be able to buy our goods. And that means that we have to take in pieces of paper. We need to have a negative capital account. So that's the summary here. Let me finish this discussion by showing you the trends in the balance of payments of the United States. First, note that the biggest deficit for the U.S. is the balance on goods. The U.S. has a positive balance on services. So when you put both of them together, trade deficit is much less than the deficit on goods trade. Two other features of the United States balance of payments that are interesting is that its balance on net income, balance of income payments, or what the Bureau of Economic Analysis calls balance on primary income, that's roughly equal to the balance on secondary income or unilateral transfers. So these two more or less cancel each other out, and as a result, the current account of the United States is roughly equal to the balance on trade. So what we see here is that the trade deficit and current account deficit were quite large and have been quite large, but much larger in the 2000s than ever since the Great Recession started in 2008. As percentage of GDP, in fact, the trade deficit has been shrinking somewhat.